Welcome back to Minds Matter, a podcast sponsored by the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. I'm Ava.
And I'm Beth. And on Minds Matter, we explore research from neuroscience and psychology while occasionally talking through our own personal experiences.
This week on the podcast, I spoke to Dr. Laura Lewis, who is a UC President's postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley. And Dr. Lewis is a biological anthropologist and a comparative psychologist. We had a really fun conversation today that is a little bit different than most of the research that we tend to talk about on the podcast, because today, instead of actually focusing on humans, we're going to focus on other great apes. So specifically in this episode, we talk about Dr. Lewis's work on chimps and bonobos in particular. And we first get our bearings talking about what great apes are, which animals count as great apes, and then we dive into Dr. Lewis's research on ape social cognition. Specifically, we talk about how they pay attention to different group mates, and we also talk about their social memory. So this is a really fun conversation, and I hope you all enjoy.
My name is Laura Lewis, and I am a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Berkeley in California in the psychology department. I consider myself a biological anthropologist and a comparative psychologist. So I study great apes, including chimpanzees, bonobos, and now children as well. And I study specifically their social psychology. So I'm really interested in how great apes process and respond to their social environments, both how we develop to do that, right, across ontogeny and our own human lifespans, but also how we've evolved to process and respond to our social environments. And that's why I study other great ape species as well, our closest living relatives, in order to really get a grasp of how we've evolved to do all sorts of things in terms of understanding each other and responding to each other and forming and maintaining social relationships.
So just so we're all on the same page, I know this is probably the most basic question ever since this is your field of study, but what exactly is included in the category of great apes? So you mentioned bonobos, chimps, and humans. Are those all the great apes? And so humans are great apes as well?
Yep, that's a great question. And it's not a stupid question at all, actually. I've thought about this a lot. I think that our education system in the US actually sometimes fails us in helping us to understand where we've come from, how we've evolved, what other animal species we're related to. So I think it's actually a really important question and one that can't ever be asked enough. So yes, we are included in a great ape family. So our great ape family is comprised of 5 different groups of living great apes. So over the past millions of years, there have been way more great ape groups and species than exist today, right? But today, there exist 5 different great ape groups. That includes orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. So we as humans are great apes. We're included in that great ape family. And so there are these 5 different groups. And we say groups because there's multiple species, like there's multiple gorilla species and there's multiple subspecies. So that's why I say there's 5 different groups of great apes.
Very interesting. I feel like orangutans seem really far away from us. So that's kind of surprising.
Absolutely. That's right. So orangutans are our most distantly related great ape species that are most distantly related to us. So we share a last common ancestor with them that lived about 16 million years ago. So when I say last common ancestor, it means if you can imagine an ape that was living around 16 million years ago, that was one species, right? And after 16 million years, it's split into different species, right? So we come from the shared common ancestor, us humans and orangutans that lived somewhere between 16 million years ago, and then we split. So we're most distantly related to orangutans in terms of the great apes. And then gorillas, we share last common ancestor with them that lived around 12 million years ago. And then really importantly for my research, we share a last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos that lived somewhere between 5 to 7 million years ago. And since that time, then humans evolved on our own lineage, and chimpanzees and bonobos actually continue to evolve as a single species.
Speaking of chimps and bonobos, since you mentioned that that's where your research focuses on, could you talk a little bit about how they evolved together but then split and those key differences and how they live now as well?
So we share a last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos that lived somewhere between 5 to 7 million years ago. And then we split. But chimpanzees and bonobos continue to evolve as on kind of the same lineage as the same species until only around 1 to 2 million years ago, which sounds like a very long time, right? A million years is a long time. But in evolutionary history and on the planet that's 4.5 billion years old, right? 1 million years is just a blip in time, right? It's very recent in terms of evolutionary history. And so because it's so recent in evolutionary history that chimpanzees and bonobos share a last common ancestor, it means they're really similar in a lot of ways. They look very similar, but they also have some really interesting differences. So what happened, I think it's a really interesting speciation process. That's what's called when one species splits into two or into multiple species. It's called speciation. So it's a really interesting speciation process that happened where this species that lived around 1 million years ago, that was kind of the ancestor of modern chimpanzees and bonobos today. It lived in kind of the central belt of Africa. So you can imagine from West Africa all through the center, all the way to Eastern Africa, kind of the central belt. And what happened around 1 to 2 million years ago, we now know, is there was a huge drought. And parts of the Congo River dried up. And the species was living near the Congo River. And when it dried up, they were actually able to walk across the riverbed. So they crossed this dry riverbed into new areas in Africa that they had never been before, including what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. So parts of this population, not the entire population, but parts of this population crossed this dry riverbed into what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then the drought lifted and the waters rose again in the Congo River. And this part of the population was now completely physically cut off from the other side, right? The other part of the population. And so they started to evolve, right, on opposite sides of the river. And they started to evolve into different species. Now, as you can imagine, we don't know exactly what happened, right? And really importantly, in this area of the world, because it is so heavily forested, there is a lot of water, we don't have a lot of fossil evidence for what exactly went on in this period, what was happening there. But we do know two really important things about this kind of new area that the species was living in. Number one, there were not gorillas or ancestors of gorillas in this area. And so that means that the species no longer had to compete with gorillas for food and for kind of home ranges, right, for where they lived. So they didn't have to compete with gorillas. And also in this new area, it was much more lush. So there was just higher abundance of fruit and other things to eat for this species. So you can imagine with no gorillas to compete with and with way more food, meaning they don't have to compete with each other, it means that they were able to spend more time with each other rather than spreading out to find resources and to protect their home ranges. So what's happened is that now they're spending more time with each other, especially the females. So the females are spending much more time with each other and they're not having to compete as much. So rates of violence are going down. Females are able to form stronger and stronger bonds. And that's actually what we see in modern day bonobos today. Number one, they have way lower rates of violence with each other and with out-group members, other members from other groups. So there's way less violence. And females are dominant in bonobos. And females form coalitions with each other. Bonobo females form strong relationships with each other that they use to curtail male violence, actually. So if a male bonobo is acting out, being violent, playing too rough with one of their babies, the females actually group together, form a coalition, form a team to try and stop that male violence. So why I kind of mentioned this whole backstory is because it has really shaped the socioecology of chimpanzees and bonobos in different ways. So bonobos are female dominant, whereas chimpanzees are male dominant. Bonobos, when they have these intergroup interactions, about 15% of the time they're violent, but most of the time they're really peaceful. And actually a new study by Laurence Mooney and Martin Serbeck just came out in Science a couple of weeks ago, showing that some bonobos actually cooperate across groups where they are actually sharing food with each other across groups. So they have these high rates of cooperation, low rates of violence, high rates of female dominance. Whereas in chimpanzees, it's a different story. Chimpanzees were on this side, were evolving on this side where they were competing with gorillas for food, and sometimes actually physically, literally compete with gorillas in terms of for space and things like this. And they are living in less lush environments where they also have to compete with gorillas and each other for food as well. So chimpanzees are male dominant. So the males are most dominant. They have higher rates of violence. When they do come into contact with other groups, they can have very violent interactions that can even be lethal. So again, you can kind of see there are some similarities, of course, between chimpanzees and bonobos. They look very similar, but there are also these really interesting differences in how the ecology has literally shaped their lives, and especially their social lives.
So why was it for the bonobos that it was the females specifically who seemed to have this time to spare to hang out? Is there a reason for that, or do we just know that it happened?
Yeah, so it's specifically that females are hanging out with each other and males are hanging out with each other. So females are able to bond with each other and form coalitions with each other that seem to be stronger than male coalitions in bonobos. Whereas it's the opposite pattern in chimpanzees. Males are quite close with one another, whereas females, because they have to spread out in the environment, and this even exists today with chimpanzees, females kind of have to spread out from each other in order to find food, so they're not constantly competing with each other for space and food. And so they're not spending as much time together, and that means they're not able to kind of bond as closely as bonobo females are. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't any female-female bonds in chimpanzees, right? But it means that there's less, and sometimes these bonds are less strong than they are in bonobos. So it's thought that because these bonobo females are able to spend a lot of time with each other, groom each other, sleep together, share food with one another, right? That they're forming these really strong bonds, and that they're able to use those bonds. They're able to form into teams with each other to protect each other from any male violence that may occur.
That's so cool.
Again, these are our closest living relatives on Earth, right? We as humans don't have any other species that are as closely related as chimpanzees and bonobos. So I think, of course, it's interesting to think about our own species in relation to chimpanzees and bonobos. That's kind of what I do in my own research, and think about, well, what are the implications for humans, right? What does a society look like with really strong female bonds, right? What does a society look like with really strong female leadership, right? We know that societies that have stronger female leadership often have lower rates of violence, right? So I think it's really interesting to kind of compare, right, across species and think about, well, what do societies look like that have male leadership, right? What are the rates of violence in those societies compared to societies that have stronger female leadership?
Yeah, that's so interesting. When you were talking about the fact that the bonobos also move to this more lush environment where there's less competition, it feels like, at least in the West, we have so much development and abundance of things. Yes. And yet we've manufactured so much competition. So It was kind of like, how come we can't do that?
Absolutely. So one more kind of idea around this that I like to think about kind of when we're comparing ourselves to bonobos and chimpanzees, and especially the difference between bonobos and chimpanzees. One more really interesting difference between them is around borders, right? So chimpanzee groups have these really distinct borders between their territories, right? They go on what we call border patrols. So the males, especially chimpanzees, will form in a line and they will patrol the edges of their territory, the borders of their territory, to defend their territory, look out for any intruders, that sort of thing. So they have these really distinct territories with really distinct borders. Bonobos, on the other hand, have overlapping territories with really porous borders. So they don't go on border patrols. They're not defending their territory. They're not spending energy defending their territory. And again, when they come into contact with neighboring groups, right, in chimpanzees, they'll have these kind of violent interactions with neighboring groups. In bonobos, they will sometimes, pretty rarely, have violent interactions with neighboring groups. Most of the time, if they come into contact with these neighboring groups, we call these intergroup interactions, interactions, they're actually quite friendly. They're very pro-social. So if they come into contact with a neighboring group, they will have kind of this big party. They'll share food with each other, they'll groom each other, have sex with each other, sleep together. And these intergroup interactions, these intergroup parties can last for weeks at a time. So they can literally be partying with their neighbors for weeks at a time, right? Whereas chimpanzees, if they see another group and there's any chance to kill their neighbors, they will. Right. And so I think it's really interesting also to think about these lower levels of violence, both within the group and between groups and bonobos, and to think about borders, right? And what that means for borders, right? Whereas chimpanzees have to have these strict borders, they have to have these strict boundaries and territories, whereas bonobos don't have to do that, right? And so, yeah, I just think it's interesting to think about what that means for us as humans too, right? That if we live in environments, as you said, right, and especially in the West, where we have abundance, right, where there's enough for everyone, there's enough land for everyone, there's enough space and food for everyone and resources, right? It's interesting to think about kind of what a world would look like if we had kind of more porous borders. I like to think about that a lot. But anyway, that's another kind of interesting, I think, difference between chimpanzees and bonobos. And again, when we think about our own human species, kind of where we fit into the picture as well, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean,
yeah,
what I'm hearing is we should have female leaders and, and maybe
period.
Get rid of some borders, but
period.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more general question with a lot of like evolutionary psych. And when we're talking about like females and males, how do you feel about like the essentialism that comes with that?
Yeah.
And is that an issue that you think about like in terms of human gender identity? Because I feel like a lot of the time evolutionary psych, it feels like it's a lot of we evolve like females are like this because, you know, we're in these spaces that are more abundant, like the ladies can chat and do their nails and whatever. Do you think about that? And is that something that concerns you, and how do you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about it all the time. And I think a lot of us who study apes are thinking about it a lot of the time. I think the first place where we can go, where we know with certainty, right, is about sexual relationships, right? So number one, we see queer sex in the animal kingdom all the time. I think there's over 200 animal species that regularly show same-sex sexual relations or sexual behavior. And especially in chimpanzees and bonobos, we know that there's a lot of same-sex sexual behavior, right? So people are more recently publishing on this, which I think is exciting. But we know, especially in bonobos, that they're having non-reproductive sex all the time. So the females are having sex with each other a lot, and this is primarily to reduce social tensions, right, before or after aggression takes place, and it's to strengthen bonds. So females who have sex with each other have stronger bonds with each other. So we know that in terms of, I don't know if I would call it sexuality necessarily, but sexual behavior, we're not just seeing male-female sexual behavior, that it's very common for individuals of the same sex to be having sex with each other, to be having non-reproductive sex. So we already know that sexual behavior is not black and white in these species. So I think that's number one. And then when you start thinking about gender identity, gender is a completely human-made concept and construct that's, I think, dissociated from sex in a lot of ways. Of course, we can talk about hormones and, you know, I think it's important that we're not just kind of throwing hormones, throwing chromosomes out the window. I think would be irresponsible of us. But I personally think that, of course, in humans, but potentially also in our great ape relatives, that the story is more complicated. I like to think about everything on a spectrum. Even in terms of chromosomes, we know that in humans, we don't just have XX and XY chromosomes. There's a whole beautiful variety out there. There's intersex people, so you can have a number of different kind of chromosome pairings. You can have a whole beautiful spectrum of physiologically what genitalia even look like. So that's kind of thinking about physically what sex looks like. Yes, kind of gametes are produced, whether gametes are produced at all, right? This is a whole spectrum. It's not just black and white. And then when you get to gender, again, this is in humans, we've completely constructed what gender is. And for us in the West, we have a concept of gender that is man and woman. It's just two. But in so many other cultures, there's so many other concepts of gender, so many other cultures have 2, 3, 4 multiple gender identities that they recognize as different gender identities. So even within humans, we don't have a clear black and white construct of what gender is. It's just man or woman, right? Because there's a lot of cultures out there that think about gender as more broad and on a broader spectrum than that. And then when you think about chimpanzees and bonobos, we have no idea if they even have conceptions for gender. I don't think we know that yet. What we do know is that in general, males and female chimpanzees and bonobos behave and they have some kind of similar characteristics. But we know also that some male and female chimpanzees and bonobos have behaviors outside of these general behavioral characteristics, right? So there are reports of, for example, female chimpanzees being very dominant and mounting others. So I think, again, I don't think we know exactly whether and if they have any conceptualization of gender. Certainly, I don't think it's the way in which we humans do, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. And I would just say, in general, umbrella is, I think it's important to think about everything on a spectrum. I think there's very, very, very little in science that's just black and white, right? And I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice if we just think about things in terms of black and white. We know that chromosomes can exist in a number of varieties. We know that hormones can exist on a spectrum across species. We know that behaviors can exist in a spectrum across species. We know that sexual relationships can exist on a spectrum between species. We know that in humans, love can exist on a spectrum within our species. So I would just say it would be a disservice to think about any of these things in terms of black and white. We know in scientists that that's rarely the case, that I think personally most of these concepts exist on a spectrum.
So the kind of heart of your work, as I understand it, is looking at the foundations of social relationships in great apes. And so one of the really important ways that we connect with other people, kind of the basis of how to connect, is like who we're paying attention to and this kind of social attention. So could you talk a little bit about your 2021 study that looked at attention to in-group and out-group members and dominant and non-dominant individuals in bonobos and chimps, and just kind of how you ran that study and how you test chimps and bonobos?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this study, we tested several populations of bonobos and chimpanzees living at zoos and sanctuaries around the world. So I went to these zoos and I used eye tracking with bonobos and chimpanzees. So eye tracking is a technology that's been around for a while, actually in use with humans, that uses an infrared camera to measure where somebody is looking, often on a screen, but you can also have non-screen based. But in our studies, we're doing screen-based eye tracking. So it's completely harmless to the animals. I don't even think they know it's happening, but we have them kind of sit in front of this infrared camera. And then the infrared camera sits below just a monitor screen where we can show them pictures on the screen. So we're showing them pictures on the screen. The infrared camera sits directly below the screen and can tell where they're looking on the screen at any given time. So in this way, in this study, we showed them two different pictures. One was a picture of a group mate of theirs, and one was a picture of a complete stranger that they didn't know of the same sex as their group mate. So they either were seeing two pictures of two males or two pictures of two females side by side. And then the eye tracker that sits below could tell whether they were looking at pictures of their group mates or pictures of strangers. And I'll just say one more fun thing about eye tracking. So again, this was developed to use with humans and especially with infants, right? So with a human adult, you can just say, please sit in front of this computer, look at these pictures. We're going to be tracking your eyes as you look at these pictures. Please stay still. With infants, you can kind of hold them on your lap, you can hold them still and have them looking at the images and keep them pretty still. With chimpanzees and bonobos, you can't ask them to please sit still and look at these images. So we have to kind of convince them to stay still. So we give them a little bit of diluted juice through a nozzle that encourages them to stay still. So they can drink a little bit of juice through the straw, basically, through this nozzle. And that keeps their heads really still as they look at these pictures on the screen. And it's really important that their head is still and just their eyes are moving so that the eye tracker can make an accurate reading and recording of their eye movements. So we're giving them a little bit of diluted juice and we're showing them pictures on a screen. So it's really enriching for them. They actually voluntarily come over. So this is completely voluntary work and completely non-invasive. So they voluntarily come over, get to drink some juice out of a straw, and look at some pictures of their group mates. And then the eye tracker is recording whether they're looking longer at images of their group mates or images of strangers. And what we found is that they are looking longer at images of their group mates of the dominant sex. So again, that means females in bonobos and males in chimpanzees. So the chimpanzees were looking longer at their male group mates, whereas the bonobos were looking longer at their female group mates. So it seems like from these results, it seems like these dominance patterns, these different dominance patterns in these different species are shaping their attention patterns. We call it social attention, who you're paying attention to. So it seems like these dominant patterns that are different between the species are differently shaping their attention. Whereas bonobos are paying attention to their female group mates and chimps are paying more attention to their male group mates. Yeah, and again, I like to think about that, and I think you do too, about what that means for us humans. This maps on perfectly to what we see in humans. We as humans do pay more attention to dominant and prestigious individuals. I like to think a lot about, in the US, about celebrities, right? We're paying attention all the time to celebrities, to these dominant individuals. Our attention is really drawn to them. And it's important, it's adaptive. Not necessarily with celebrities, but it's important to pay attention to dominant individuals because these individuals often are the most knowledgeable. They have a lot of knowledge in the group. They have a lot of power in the group. They often are the ones to make the decisions about where the group goes, where the group sleeps at night, what's the safest area for the group to be in. So it's actually adaptive to be paying attention to these individuals who may have some of the most knowledge in the group.
Well, that's so interesting. So in the study, if the chimp or the bonobo themselves was like a super dominant individual, were they less likely to want to participate? Were they doing it for less time? Because if someone has juice, they might like give it to them because they're, I don't know how it works, but maybe like sitting pretty on their rock or whatever. And were they also showing the same kinds of patterns where they were also looking at the more dominant other group members?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did, I think, get a good variety of individuals participating in the study. So yeah, we had dominant individuals, we had subordinate individuals coming up and having juice, and it really depended kind of on the day. Sometimes the dominant individuals were engaged in trying to defend their dominant status. They weren't coming around and having juice. And other days when the group was calmer, then they could come and wouldn't have to necessarily defend their dominant status and could hang out with us and have some juice and look at these images. We didn't look at kind of individual differences in terms of these patterns. So we think overall we're seeing these patterns across groups, but it is something I think about a lot, whether there are any individual differences. What we were able to test is the sex of the subject themselves, and we didn't see any difference there. So we didn't see any differences in our male subjects versus our female subjects in either species, which I think is interesting. So it seems like these results are the same for the male chimps and bonobos and the female chimps and bonobos that participated in this study.
I guess it makes sense because even if you're dominant, you still kind of have to pay attention to the other dominant people.
Yeah, definitely.
So in the eye tracking, I remember how you could see the dots on the faces of the apes, and then you could also see when they were doing like a saccade, so when they were like looking somewhere else.
Yep, that's right.
So in humans, I think there's evidence that at least cross-culturally and maybe also in terms of like dominance as well and some emotions, like if you're feeling guilty, you might not look at someone's eyes and people might look more at the mouth or the nose. So did you see any evidence of something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, our eyes are doing all sorts of things that kind of give our emotions away, which I think is fascinating. So we were not looking at kind of the areas of the face that they were paying attention to in this study. And you can imagine, right, with humans, you can ask, hey, which one are you more interested in? Or just pay attention to the face you find most interesting or something, right? We couldn't ask the chimps that or the bonobos that. So we were really just putting these pictures on the screen and measuring their natural behavior when they see these images images, right? So we couldn't ask them to differentiate between these individuals. And we didn't even know before doing this study if they could differentiate between group mates and strangers. We thought it was probably very likely that they could differentiate between strangers and their group mates, but we weren't sure. So this was kind of a first pass of, do they differentiate between their group mates and strangers, which now we know they do. We weren't asking like what areas of the face they may be using to differentiate between faces of group mates and faces of strangers. Although because the eye tracker is recording everything, we technically have that data. So if there's anyone out there who's interested in looking at where on the face they're paying attention to, especially of the group mates, I think it would be a fascinating follow-up study to kind of really dig into where on the face they may be looking as they're looking at faces of their group mates and faces of strangers. But what we do know, not from my own research, but research by my co-author on the study and colleague, Dr. Fumihiro Kano, who I call him the father of great ape eye tracking, because he really figured out that you could even do this eye tracking with great apes and started doing it at Kumamoto Sanctuary in Japan, where he often works. So the first studies that he did was really to see where chimpanzees and bonobos are looking on faces when they're shown these images. And he found something really fascinating, at least maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I think it's fascinating, which is that chimpanzees are much more focused on kind of this mouth region, and bonobos are much more focused on the eye region, which is similar to us as humans. As humans, we're paying a lot of attention to others' eyes, right? Same with bonobos, whereas chimpanzees are paying a lot more attention to others' mouths. And it's interesting to think about why that may be. Kano and colleagues think that it's because of the way we communicate, right? That we as humans communicate a lot with our eyes. There's a lot of communication we're doing. Same with bonobos, right? When you're working with them, they're holding a lot of eye contact. It's almost a little off-putting kind of how much eye contact they'll hold with you. So they're communicating a lot with their eyes, whereas chimpanzees are communicating a lot more with their mouths. And I think sometimes in chimpanzees, but definitely in other primate species as well, it's often seen like direct eye contact can be very threatening, actually. So it's almost the opposite, right? So whereas with humans and bonobos, there's a lot of connection and communication that's going on as we look into others' eyes, which seems to be the case in bonobos as well. So we do know that they have these kind of different looking patterns when they're looking at faces.
That's so interesting. I love that.
Good.
I like that the nice bonobos are doing things like us a little bit. We're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there to be like the bonobos.
Yeah, exactly.
So I thought the finding that these chimps and bonobos look longer at dominant individuals was really interesting, especially kind of course, in our anthropomorphizing, kind of bringing it back to humans and just like us centering humans more than anthropomorphizing. And I was kind of thinking about this idea of dominance, and obviously this seems like intuitive that we would look longer at people who are higher status or who are just like more central. But it made me think of the consequences of this, and I was reminded of this really interesting work from Betsy Levy-Palak, who's at Princeton in, I think, Psych and Public Policy. And she's been doing these studies, I think, over the last decade, and on like social network analyses in schools. So they'll take an entire middle school, and I think they did this in maybe 50 middle schools, where they asked every single person in the middle school to write down not necessarily who they think the leader is, but who they pay attention to. So the people that have the most eyes on them. And then they did this intervention where like they brought all of these kind of leaders into a room, and all these people were like, this is so weird, like, how did you find us? Because it was like some jocks, it was some quiet kids, but like the leader of the nerds, like some musical theater kids, and it was just all these central people to all these different groups who weren't friends with each other. And she brought them in, and then they did an intervention with them where they were like, how would you make your school better? So they asked them to come up with a way to kind of reduce bullying, but where they wanted. So some people chose anti-fatness, some people chose racism, some people chose just the fact that there's so many cliques, but they were in charge of the type of intervention that they wanted to do. And she has these amazing results where she finds that having these people kind of like lead campaigns, because there are so many eyes on them, it does lead to reductions in how aggressive the school is, the bullying that happens at the school. And then she did this at so many schools. And in some of the schools, instead of picking the leaders, they randomly chose people to do this intervention with, and that didn't do anything.
Wow.
So, like, it really has to be the leaders.
That's
and I
so
was like,
interesting.
So it just made me think Laura's work just kind of felt like the foundation of why that intervention works, right? Because we just tend to pay attention to these people who are trendsetters and who are important, and their behavior really does then trickle down to the rest of the population.
That makes me really mad about how little celebrities are doing. Do you know what I mean?
Maybe. But I also think, not to say poor celebrities, but I feel like when celebrities do get involved with things, they get hate no matter what. So.
Yeah, but if their influence in terms of that stuff is so strong, maybe it's like not living these lavish lifestyles, and because then that's what we want.
That's true. But we need a researcher to come in and intervene and say, we're going to do a...
Yeah, we're going to get you all together.
Because the kids wouldn't have done it alone, right? That's the thing. Yeah, so, like, they need to be told. And I think, like, they're also victims of, like, social norms, I guess. And I remember someone that I met, well, I don't know if they coined the term, but they used this word affluenza, which I was obsessed with.
Oh, yeah, what's that
again?
And
I feel like becoming sick to the head because you become so rich.
Right. So
I'm sure that when you reach those levels of status that you're kind of lost in a way. But maybe we need a researcher to
Ava's always sticking up for the celebrities.
I feel bad for celebrities. I would never in my life want to be a celebrity. It's like my worst nightmare. It sounds horrendous. I feel so bad for Khloe Kardashian. My heart goes out to her.
Why?
Because I feel like they're under this microscope. It's stressful. And, like, yes, they're rich, but it's like, I don't know, Beth. Like, the time that we had that little TikTok go viral, like, barely. Like, we had, like, 300,000 views, and then all those bros were like, I can't believe this dumb girl, like, hasn't watched Terminator. I was like, oh my god, this is so hurtful. And that wasn't even, like, a character attack or anything. But I could only imagine if someone was like, you're ugly, you're stupid, all your life decisions are dumb, like, all of this stuff. Just seems like too much.
I think that
I wish it on my worst enemy.
I don't know. I don't want to say anything too bold about celebrity psyche, but I feel like they kind of want all that attention. Because there's celebrities who you don't know much about. Like, that's also an option. I'm not going to feel sorry for the Kardashians. I just can't. I'm sorry.
I feel sorry for Khloe. Let me be clear.
Well, we have a fun little story from when we just hung out recently and had a celebrity encounter.
An illustration of how dominance
it's
so important and people pay attention to it,
So in Santa Barbara, it was so funny. I was asking Ava, oh, do you guys see celebrities everywhere? Because I don't know if you guys know, but Santa Barbara is where all these famous people, like Oprah lives there, right? So you kind of drive around to these different strip malls, which are really lovely, with big cars and I don't know. It's an interesting experience. But we were at one of these strip malls having breakfast, and I looked and I was like, oh, that's an attractive man. And I was like, oh my God, it's John Legend. And who was he with? Chrissy Teigen. And it captured all our attention.
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because no one bothered them. So I don't think anyone said anything to them, which was very nice. But it spread like wildfire. And this is like a little brunch spot that UCSB students go to on the weekends because it's nearby campus. But we were like running into people that we knew there, and we hadn't spoken to them about seeing John Legend or Chrissy Teigen walk by us. And everyone was like, did you see them? Did you hear? Did you hear? And it was just like, it spread so quickly. And it was people who had missed them were asking us about it. So it was really like, wow, everyone's attention was definitely shifted by these quote unquote dominant individuals, I guess because they're celebrities. And yeah, I felt it. I was like, they were sitting right in front of us. I was staring at the window. Like, I really wanted to see what they ordered. So
they seemed really nice. If anyone wants that gossip, don't you think they seemed nice?
They seemed so nice. Honestly, the whole experience made me so happy because I feel like they just genuinely seemed like who they portrayed themselves to be, like happy, in love, just living their lives, low key. Like Chrissy seemed pretty quirky, just doing her thing, and it made me feel like they weren't putting on a show. So that was very nice to see. Yeah. And maybe people will be interested in this because it's about dominant individuals. And some people will probably be like, who The F are you talking about?
Yeah, no, I have been telling the story and some people are like, what are you talking about, Beth?
But I think that's an interesting thing too, is like for chimps and bonobos, dominance seems a lot clearer, like the hierarchy seems much clearer. But in the human world, there's so much room for not just a main culture, but all these subcultures. So who you look up to as dominant is really different. And I guess you could say that leaders of states, they'll garner a lot of attention, not just because we give them status just for no real reason, like just because they're talented singers or they're really pretty and they're models and maybe they can cook, but because they actually have stake in what happens in the world. That seems more like the situation with chimps. So it'd kind of be interesting to see in humans if we were to compare attention paid to some celebrities versus attention paid to what leaders of states are doing, like people who actually have a stake in what's going to happen in your life. Because cynically, I would say that at this point, our manufactured worlds have kind of taken over even our stake in our own material happiness and what happens to our society. I would guess that people would maybe pay more attention to news about Kim Kardashian than
I think
news
so.
about Donald Trump.
Hands down. Like
Donald Trump.
Yeah, I agree. I reckon it would be celebrities. We know everything they're doing, eating, working out, everything. Their houses, what they buy. It's crazy.
This is just a silly question, but are you able to tell the apes apart when you're in a sanctuary or you're at a zoo? Like, do you feel like you get to know them? And like, are you like, oh, that's this one coming?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's really important that we can differentiate between the apes so that we know who is coming into the testing room, who's actually doing the research, right? We have actually very specific tests for each individual. So we have to know every single ape that we're working with. This, when I first started working with apes more than 10 years ago, actually was really hard for me to do. And now it's quite easy to tell them apart. But yeah, when you first start working with them, it's a little hard to tell them apart. Now that I've been working with them for a long time, it's much easier to tell them apart. So it can take, maybe if you're working with a new group of, let's say, 20 chimps or 20 bonobos, it can take about a week or two to learn all the differences between individuals. And in the zoos and sanctuaries, they're given names by their human caretakers, right? So they each have different names. There's Freck and Rennie and Louie and Louise. And when I say their names, I can think about what they look like. They also, like humans, have really different personalities, right? Rennie is kind of shy and super silly. Caffsey is the dominant male at Edinburgh Zoo, and he's kind of, oh man, he's funny. He's kind of walks around kind of like looking all big and bad. And then there's Valoo, who's 10 now, so he's hitting puberty as a male and, you know, kind of annoying everyone. Then there's Miss Cindy. She's the small baby. I think she's around 4 years old now, and she's really silly and playful and giggly. So they all have really different personalities as well, which I find just really endearing and special. And again, so similar to us as humans, right? We all have individual differences and personalities. Same with chimpanzees and bonobos.
And do you feel like they know you?
That's a great question. Yeah, definitely. I think they definitely know me and remember me when I haven't seen them for a while. They actually joked at the zoo because I was doing this research where I was kind of constantly giving them this diluted juice. Mm-hmm. The keepers called me the juice lady, right? So they may have just known me as the juice lady. But yeah, I think because they can definitely differentiate between each other, I think they can definitely differentiate between humans. They get scared when they see the vet coming, for example. Mm-hmm. They get excited when they see caretakers coming. There's stories of, especially there was like a couple bonobos that I worked with that were like really shy around some of the women that worked with them. Oh. So they definitely differentiate between humans. And they also, I think they may remember us when they haven't seen us for a while. So this is a study that's coming out very soon. It will be published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where we show that chimpanzees and bonobos have long-term memory for each other. So this is a study very similar to the one I described earlier, the 2021 study, where again, we're using eye tracking. We're showing two pictures on the screen. And instead of a picture of a current groupmate and a stranger, we're showing a picture of a former or previous groupmate and a stranger. So a groupmate that has either died or left the group some time ago. And in our main sample, we had images of groupmates that had either died or left the group somewhere between 1 and 10 years before the study. And then in our larger sample, we actually had some trials from a bonobo who hadn't seen her sister and nephew for almost 27 years. So in this larger sample, we have even longer time spans. And what we find is that both chimps and bonobos are looking significantly longer at their images of the previous groupmates as compared to the images of the strangers. So that indicates to us that there's some sort of recognition of their previous groupmates that hints that they might have some memory of these individuals. They at least can recognize these previous groupmates and differentiate them from complete strangers, right? And again, this data goes back a decade and potentially even longer than that. We have less trials from the bonobo who hadn't seen her sister and nephew for 27 years, but she also was looking a lot longer at the images of her sister and nephew than at the images of the stranger. So they do seem like they remember their previous groupmates. And then we had one more interesting finding in this paper, which is that we asked the keepers that had worked with these previous groupmates about their relationships with the apes in our study. So we asked them to rate rates of positive relationships, rates of negative relationships or interactions between the previous groupmates and the apes that participated in our study, and also relative dominance. And we found that chimps and bonobos look significantly longer at their previous groupmates with whom they had more positive social relationships. So this finding is weaker, definitely, but still significant. And we think it means that you can imagine they're looking longer at individuals that they had these positive histories with. You could call them, I would call them their friends, right? That they're looking longer at their previous friends as compared to images of strangers. We didn't find that they were looking longer at individuals with whom they had more negative social interactions or that relative dominance played a role. But we did find this, I think, fascinating finding that they're looking longer at individuals with whom they had more positive social relationships.
I feel like those findings, especially the one about, I know that's not data, but it's like so anecdotal kind of, but about the bonobo who hadn't seen her sister in so long. It's like, oh, like they're definitely just like us and they have these strong relationships, which it seems like they really do. But do you feel like there's a tension in how you're interpreting your results of not wanting to anthropomorphize too much? Or do you think that we've actually gone in the past thinking about animals, we've been specious and not allowing them as much consciousness and relationships as they really do have? How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I think you characterize the fields really, really well. There's kind of these two tensions, right? One is, we may anthropomorphize too much and kind of think, okay, us as humans, then of course they have all these things that we humans have, like gender, for example. And then in another way, we are doing this specious thing, I think, where we're thinking like we as humans are so special and intellectual and we have all these abilities that no other animals have, right? And I think we need to land actually somewhere in the middle, right? So we want to be careful not to anthropomorphize. But I think actually in the history of being cautious around anthropomorphism, we're giving them less credit than they deserve in terms of their intellectual capacities, in terms of the importance of their relationships with one another. And you can even see that in terms of our conservation efforts with them, right? These are species that are incredibly endangered. And it's estimated that we may lose bonobos in our lifetime, that bonobos, our closest living relatives, may go extinct in our lifetime, right?
God,
it's
wow.
really scary. So actually, Joan Silk has this wonderful paper called The F Word in Primatology, and that's describing how primatologists were scared for so long to use the word friendship to describe these social relationships because we didn't want to anthropomorphize. I think now a lot of us can recognize that a lot of their social relationships, these positive, close bonds that they have with each other that can last for years or decades, right? That are really meaningful to them in terms of purely their survival and well-being, that these are, I would think of them as somewhat like friendships, right? Of course, they may be different from our human friendships, but they do have strong social bonds with each other that can last for years or decades and that are adaptive, that actually have implications for their survival and their well-being. So their social relationships with one another are incredibly important, just like our human social relationships are important for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like at a certain point, like, what more could you want to say that there's friendship? It's just hard to not say that there might be, like, even something like love between, you know, a sibling or whatever. But I know, like, you know, we shouldn't say those things. But I think it's a really fascinating to think. It's something I think about too. I was just talking with a colleague 2 days ago about whether chimpanzees and bonobos experience love. I don't think that's something we should shy away from, actually. I think that's something we should really think about, because I think it really does have implications for how we think about these species and whether or not we protect them. If we see these species as more similar to us, as individuals that can have deep friendships, that can love one another, as a human species, we're going to want to conserve these species, right? We're going to want to put more efforts to conserving a species that we think of as more similar to us as humans. So I actually think it's really important for conservation efforts to not shy away from thinking about bonobo and chimpanzee emotions, to not shy away from at least contemplating whether they can feel love. We know at least that they have these deeply close social relationships, that they seem to show behaviors of caring for one another, like grooming each other, sleeping together, right? That they're spending a vast majority of their lives very close to one another. So I don't think it's a disservice to them to think about whether they can feel love. I think that's actually a really interesting kind of conceptual and theoretical question.
I really loved listening to this episode, and I thought Laura's research was so interesting, and it made me think about a lot of things. And when you guys were talking about the love between the great apes and the relationships, and it's funny because I definitely feel animals experience love to one another and other species, and I felt like very connected to my pet dogs and all those kinds of things. But I was remembering when I watched My Octopus Teacher. Can you remember that? It was like a documentary about a man who quit his life to record things and spend time with an octopus. Can you remember that?
Yes.
So I think it ended up winning an Oscar or something, and I didn't finish it. So everything I'm going to say that's scathing about this documentary, I want to preface with I didn't actually finish it, because I was watching it and I got so angry I left. We were watching it with my friends, because in this situation, which I think can happen, the person who was the documentary guy was just completely anthropomorphizing the octopus in this way that meant that the octopus was just, everything it did was just about him. And I found that I really didn't like it. And I was like, how can this be going so well and everything? And then I was reading marine biologists talk about it. And these marine biologists were saying, like, they were agreeing with me, so my opinion isn't like totally crazy, but they were saying that it doesn't really matter if what the octopus was feeling. What matters is if people engage with this, then they'll be more curious about the ocean, care more about the ocean and animals in the ocean. And I thought that was interesting, and I feel like that's interesting as a scientist to like, okay, well, what he's saying about the octopus is maybe not what's going on, but it doesn't really matter, because in terms of like an art form, which I guess documentary kind of is an art form, people watch it and then feel connected to the octopus and then have that more connection with an ocean. So I don't know if you had the same feelings when you watched it.
Okay, so I watched it a long time ago. I didn't have super strong reactions to it other than thinking, that's cool. Like, that's amazing. And maybe it was just more even to the idea of like a person having such a strong connection to an octopus, like even from that side. So even like the ability to anthropomorphize the octopus as much as he did, I think was interesting. And I'm not the biggest animal person, as you know.
Yeah, I know. That's why, yeah.
So I was just like, wow, so foreign. What a, what a different way of life. Although, I don't love other mammals that much, but I'm really good with bugs. Like, I'm really into bugs, as I think.
Yeah, I did know that. Yeah.
So I feel like octopuses? Octopuses? I don't know. I used to have hermit crabs, kind of the same vibe. And I think I didn't react as strongly about the anthropomorphizing, also because that documentary came out in a time where I feel like it was the fashion to talk about octopuses, and there was another book at the time that was basically talking about how smart these animals are. So I was like, yeah, why not? But I think what's interesting about thinking about these types of animals versus bonobos and chimps is that Laura was describing the fact that she's researching bonobos and chimps because they're our closest living relatives. So it kind of feels like it makes more sense to say, oh, these things that we experience, they're more likely to experience it as well. But then with octopuses and squids, all of the things that they're able to do that's amazing, like opening jars to escape, tricking researchers who are around them if they don't like them, like putting ink in their face or whatever, those feel like they're things that happened convergently. So we branched off the evolutionary tree so long ago. So it feels like their cognition is something that like we can barely even understand, even though it seems like maybe there's some kind of intention that we can understand behind some of those actions, but it just feels like it's like a completely different world. Almost like the idea of how birds can see more colors than us. It's like I can understand that you see more colors, but I think the theory of mind for octopuses is much different. So I kind of agree that maybe we should be a little bit more careful about anthropomorphizing them. I will say also, it sounds like your problem with this guy was not just that he was anthropomorphizing the octopus, but that he was just like selfish. Maybe if it was about a woman, you also would have been like, not everything she does is about you, okay?
No,
like,
I think that was the thing. I was like, why do we think that this, like, you're the center of this octopus's universe? I don't know. And it was like just normal octopus behaviors. I feel like people are going to get really upset by this because people love that documentary.
I think so too.
How
dare you? How dare you?
And just normal behaviors of like sussing out an environment and seeing if something's a threat. It was like, it loves me. It's like, no, it's just checking out what's going on. Anyway, but I didn't finish it. So I just want to say maybe it did other things going on that showed love.
I think there's some kind of dramatic climax. I don't remember what it was. And this is, I'm sure, going to be where people comment, you don't even remember what happened. Yeah. You didn't even watch the whole thing. Okay. How dare you? But I will say that I kind of had the same thought when Laura was talking about it's not a disservice to these animals to think about them having love and experiencing friendship and these things that we typically ascribe only to humans. But I was like, it's pretty sad that that's what we need to care. And with octopuses that are like so far away from our evolutionary tree, like we still, that it feels that, as I said, like I don't feel that I can fully understand their cognition because it feels so different and developed in this completely different way, especially because they don't even have a central nervous system, right? Like their brain is just everywhere.
I think so. Yeah, like in its tentacles.
So that's very different to us. I mean, maybe not if you're an embodied cognition person, but you know, there's something to be said about the fact that like our genetic makeup is so different, and the reasons that they developed these different types of cognition, maybe some of the social cognition too, if we want to ascribe that to them, was probably for very different evolutionary pressures. So it just feels sad that we can't even appreciate, oh, these might be actually super different from us. We need to be like, oh, they're just
they
like
have to
me.
be. Yeah, I think that's the thing. I was like, why do we have to be the center of everything? Maybe that's like, why does it have to be about us? Why can't they be doing their thing? Why do we have to make it about us? Because then another thing when I was thinking about this, when Laura was giving the example of, I can't remember what species it was that saw the picture of its sister, and was it sister and nephew or something?
Yeah.
And I got really upset by that they...
I knew you were going to have some type of strong emotional reaction to that.
I did. I got really upset by it because I was worried that...
Wait, why upset?
Because I can't cry right now on the podcast. Have I cried on the podcast yet?
I don't think so. I don't think we've gone there yet.
I think this will be it. Just the idea that they miss their family so much. And then I was like, am I projecting onto the monkeys?
Yeah, because it might not be that, right? And I think that's the thing too, is like pulling back to be like, okay, what was the actual experiment? It was that they were looking longer at these pictures. But I do think, especially because it's quite abstract, because it's just how long are they looking at these pictures, I really feel that you can read whatever you want into it, because I feel like your reaction to the study is like, oh my god, she misses her, this is so upsetting, maybe she's gonna like think about it for the rest of the day.
Yeah, exactly.
And to me, like, the thing I took away from it was like, oh, like, because they also had the finding of chimps and bonobos, right? They were looking longer at people from their past, other apes, individuals from their past that they had more positive relationships with. So I was like, oh, that's so nice. Like, my interpretation was, in your old age, you just are like so mellow and you don't even want to think about the negative stuff. You're just like, I remember that person, have a happy contemplation while looking at their picture, and then you move on and you're just happy and serene.
That is
and
so
like,
funny.
This person is going home crying. She's going to her little branch.
And all they want to do is like I was thinking of Paddington Bear and like how much he misses his family. Anyway, I was like, oh no, that's like the great apes.
Whoa. Interesting. Well, it's interesting to think which of our views would be more useful to tug at people's heartstrings for conservation efforts.
Maybe mine?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
It's more sad.
I'm curious what everyone else thinks.
Okay, so to wrap up, could you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on now and what's next that you're really excited about?
Yeah, maybe one project that I'll talk about now is my first true comparative project, where I'm testing chimpanzees and kids side by side using the same paradigm. So we just wrapped data collection on the third study with kids. And in January, I'll be going to Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Uganda to run the exact same study with chimpanzees, where we're exploring something that I call social curiosity. So it's this idea of being curious about others and about others' social interactions. So we are testing whether kids and chimps are more curious about social interactions between two individuals as compared to just an individual acting on its own. So we're showing them videos, and they have the choice to choose to watch videos of two individuals interacting or a video of an individual acting alone. We're also testing if they're more interested in or more curious about positive social interactions, right? Like playing or grooming, versus negative interactions like having conflict or crying. And so we've tested that with kids. We're in the middle of data analysis now. And next month, I'll go to test this exact same thing with chimpanzees, where they'll see videos of chimpanzees, of course. And we're trying to understand if they're more curious about social interactions and which types of social interactions.
What are your hypotheses? So do you think that chimps, because they're more aggressive, maybe would they be more interested in the negative interactions, and then maybe like attachment styles? Do you think that could influence what's going on with the kids?
Yeah, that's definitely one thought, is that because these negative interactions, conflicts are so important in chimpanzee social life, one hypothesis is that they'll be more interested and curious about these negative interactions. And kids, where positive interactions are super common in our daily lives and have important implications, of course, in our daily lives, that they'll be more interested in these social interactions. And then we also thought about the flip, right? The alternative hypothesis, that kids are more curious about negative interactions, potentially because they are less common, that kids may be just more curious and need to gather information, that it's adaptive for kids to gather information about negative interactions because they're less common. And the same with chimpanzees, that they may need to gather information about positive social interactions because there's a lot of important information there that may be adaptive for them. So yeah, the fun thing about the study is I could see it going either way, for chimps and for kids. And that's nice, because in science, often we can get really tied up with our hypotheses, kind of tie our ego to our hypotheses. So in this way, I feel really free with this study, that kind of in any direction the data goes, I'm going to be excited, and I think will be really interesting and useful for kind of thinking about social curiosity further.
We'll definitely be staying tuned. And thank you again so much for being on today. And thank you for sharing all your knowledge and also all your thoughts about the field with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure talking with you and thinking about great apes and our own evolution with you. It's truly been a pleasure. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you to Dr. Laura Lewis for joining us this episode. Our intro and outro music is Nobody Stayed for the DJ by Glacio. Our transition music is Back for More, also by Glacio. Minds Matter is mixed, edited, and created by Beth Fisher, she's the Australian one, and me, Ava Madasouza. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode, but in the meantime, find all our episodes and show notes on mindsmatterpodcast.com.